Hello everyone, it's Miss Cindy with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater St. Louis. I'm back today in my kitchen to give you another cooking lesson. Today we're going to make white bean chicken chili, which is one of my family's favorites, and hopefully it will be yours too. All right, there are a couple things that we need to take care of. First, I'm going to put an apron on so that my clothing is protected. You don't have to have an apron, but if you don't have an apron, I would suggest that you wear clothing that you don't mind if it gets a little greasy. What we're making today can sometimes pop and splatter at the stove and can stain your clothing. So I'm putting my apron on, and what do you think is wrong that we need to take care of? If you look at me, my hair is down. If you have longer hair, you should put it up. You can put a scarf over it, you can tie it back, but whatever you do, you want to get your hair out of the way. You don't want to find hair in food. That is yucky. There's nothing more unappetizing than finding a hair in the food that you're eating, even if it's your own. All right, my hair is back. Now I touched my hair, I touched my face, I touched my apron. Now I have to wash my hands. So I'm gonna go wash my hands. Before I wash my hands, I'm gonna push my glasses up because they're trying to slide off my face. All of those things mean you have to wash your hands. And you know the rule, 20 seconds. We're gonna be using a knife and a cutting board today. Anytime you use a cutting board, if you put a wet towel under it, your board won't slide around. It will stay put a little bit more. Now my hands are wet and I don't want them to slide around on the knife either, so I am drying my hands. I have some spices. All right, this first spice is called coriander. I'm going to take about 2 teaspoons of coriander and put it in my cup. This next spice is cumin. You're probably familiar with cumin. And I'm going to get a great big heaping tablespoon of cumin. It's actually probably about 4 teaspoons worth. And then I'm also going to get a tablespoon of oregano. And then I want a couple of bay leaves. They look just like a leaf from a tree. And these are pretty small, so I'm actually getting a third out. Some leaves are larger. You can see the difference. Like this would have been a big leaf, but it's broken in half. This is another half of a large leaf. Those were small, so we went with 3 instead of 2. And last, I have chili powder. You can use whatever chili powder you like. I recommend starting with a small amount. You can always add more later, but you don't want to get your chili too spicy unless everyone in your family likes really spicy. I'm going to start with 1 tablespoon because mine is a little bit on the spicy side. Then I'm going to get all of these jars out of the way. All right, now that we have our spices, I'm going to sit them next to the stove because the next time we use them, we'll be at the stove. You notice I didn't add salt and pepper to those spices. I like to add those spices at the very, very end because salt can sometimes make your beans get a little bit tougher, and we will be using beans in our chili. You can always add more salt if you don't have enough, but you can't take it out. So I like to add it at the very end after I taste things and see what I think it needs. Sometimes it doesn't need any at all. I have some vegetables in front of me. I like to add vegetables to my chili, but they need to cook in different stages. So I'm going to explain that, and I'm going to show you how to chop them. The first one that we have here, I'm going to get the tablespoon measuring spoons out of the way as well. The first one we have here is an onion. I'm sure you've all worked with onions before. Sometimes they can make your eyes water. I have empty bowls that I'm going to put things in after I get them chopped. The onion, you'll see it has 2 parts. An end part, this is the top. I'm sorry, this is the bottom where the roots would have come out of. And this is the top where the green portion that would have come out of the ground. We want to slice those 2 off. and get it off of our cutting board. Now, once we get our onion cut open, we don't want this papery wrapper. So I'm gonna peel it off so that I just have the onion left. This time of year, your onions can sometimes be very hot. That means that your eyes will burn more than they might at a different time of the year. The reason being, onions are a fall vegetable. So most of the onions you'll get right now were dug last fall, September, October, maybe even November. And when they're fresh, they don't burn as much. But after they sit around a while, they get more oils that accumulate, and those oils become hotter. So I'm gonna throw these scraps away just to get them out of the way. And then I'm gonna chop my onion. You see it's in half. I'm gonna start from the direction of where I made the cut, and I'm just gonna cut straight across. And then I'm gonna turn my onion and I'm gonna cut straight across again. This gives me small chunks of onion. This is the size we want. So we're gonna get the onion off the board and put it in one of our empty bowls. Now I noticed this part wasn't falling apart because it still has a little bit of the end where the root was on it. I'm just gonna cut that off. Otherwise we'll have that huge chunk of onion in our chili. There we go. I'm gonna do the same thing with the other half. We're also going to put, and this might sound weird to you guys because most people don't do this, we're gonna put some celery and carrots in our chili because it makes the broth richer. Pardon my dog. I'm cutting the ends off, but I'm putting these in a little container because I can use those for making vegetable stock or making chicken stock later. Whenever you have veggie scraps you're not going to put in your food, save them. You can compost them and use them in the garden, or you can make broth out of them. They're very valuable. They have uses. Me, I will put it in here, put a lid on it, put it in my freezer until I've gathered enough to make vegetable broth. So now that I've cut my celery, I want it in small pieces, so I also cut through the center. And do you remember from the last lesson, this part of our knife stays on the board. All of our power comes from this back portion, and it's a rocking motion. There's a little bit of onion wrapper on my board we don't want. So we're just gonna chop it like this to get small pieces. If you like big pieces, you could leave it larger. Now these leaves are delicious, but we don't want them in our chili. We're gonna save those for making veggie broth. Every part of the celery is edible. All right, so these are our celery chunks. We'll add them to this bowl. Now the celery and carrot takes about the same amount of time to cook, so we'll mix those together when we are sauteing. So we're gonna move right on to our carrot and put it in the same bowl. I'm gonna cut the top off, and I'm gonna put it in my scrap container because it is useful still. Now this is a pretty big carrot, so I'm gonna cut it in half first, and then I'm gonna cut that half in half. That leaves me with two pieces with flat edges. If you set the flat edges down, they can't roll on your board and it's safer. You're less likely to cut yourself. I'm gonna cut those in half again. And same thing. I'm just gonna chop it. Whenever you're cooking, always prep everything before you move to the stove. It just makes things more efficient, and that way you don't burn things when you realize you forgot to chop something. A lot of people don't add celery or carrot to chili, but it just adds a little bit of depth, and your broth will be richer and your chili will taste better. Now we have tomatoes. These are pretty big. We may only need one for the amount of chili we're making, because we're making a white chili, not a red chili. So the first thing I'm gonna do is poke a little hole in the skin and then slice the top off. Tomatoes can be a little bit tricky with this kind of knife if you're not familiar with using knives. If you have trouble slicing a tomato and it feels like you're smashing it, you could use a serrated knife. I'll grab one and show you. This is a serrated knife. Do you see the little scallops on the edges? That slices through things like tomatoes very easily. I'll show you. I'm gonna flip my tomato over so the flat end is down, same reason. And I'm just gonna cut right through it. See how easy that is? I'm not sawing, I'm just one motion. And those serrated edges slice through without smushing. It's like a bread knife. If you have a bread knife that has a serrated edge, you can use it for tomatoes. It works great. And I'm just making small pieces out of big pieces, as we like to say around our house. All right, I'm gonna put this in this bowl. I know it seems like I have a lot of bowls, but they're important and they can be handy. You can pick up bowls at thrift stores or dollar stores. Now looking at that in the bowl, I think I do want both tomatoes. And there's still some good on this top. I'm gonna cut it off and add it. I'll put this in my scrap bucket. And same thing with the other tomato. And I'm almost done cutting my tomato. One thing I wanted to mention, before you start chopping vegetables, you should always wash them. I washed my vegetables before we started taping, so they were clean already. I prepared a little bit before starting, but if you were pulling them right out of your fridge and right out of a bag, you definitely want to wash them because there can be all kinds of things on them you don't want. There can be residue from insects, there can be pesticides, there can be lots of things on your veggies. You want to rinse them off. Don't use soap. Just use water and rub them pretty well under the water. Now, I have tomato juices on my board. I'm going to flip it because that could make what I'm doing next dangerous. It could make it slide around. My hand is also wet. So I'm going to grab my cooking towel, which will go into the laundry after this session, and I'm going to dry my hand. Do you remember what this is? This is garlic. This is super important for chili. So I'm gonna cut the top off. I am on an island that has wheels, so it wiggles a little bit if I move too much. Now I'm not putting these papery parts into my scrap bin because the papery parts don't impart much flavor and we don't want them in it. It's just like the onion wrapper, we'll throw it away. So remember from the marinara lesson, this is a clove. When I showed it to you whole, it was called a head. I'm gonna smash it a little. Don't try that unless you feel very confident with your knife skills because that helps loosen the paper. What it does is it twists the garlic a little bit inside so the paper doesn't stick to it so much. Otherwise, it'll take you a lot longer to peel. I do have a dog, as you can tell. There's a little edge on my garlic that looks a little less than desirable. We're just going to cut that off and discard it. The garlic itself is fine though. We're going to use all of this garlic because it's chili and it needs it. All right, now that we have all the skins off our garlic, we're gonna mince it up. If you have a handy garlic mincer or a garlic press, you can use that. I have one somewhere, but I don't like having to wash it because it's hard to get the garlic out of the tiny holes. So I'm just doing it by hand. Notice that my knife is not leaving the cutting board. My fingers guide the garlic until it gets close to the end and then I pull my fingers back. Once you get it in little pieces, I am pushing it off with my finger, but your press in the direction that the blade is. You never go against it. You would cut yourself. So I'm just moving across it to get it into smaller pieces. All right, and I need one more small bowl to put my garlic in. Luckily, my bowls are underneath the island that we are prepping on, so it's very easy to grab them. I'm just going to put it in there. Oops, and I spilled a little on the counter. Okay. So we have garlic, we have tomatoes, we have carrots and celery, we have onions. These are green chilies. These are very important when you're making a white bean chicken chili. They add a certain flavor that you can't get from anything else. Your chili would still be good if you don't have these, but if you have them, add it because it just adds a little extra something special. And then here we have white beans. Now you can buy your beans in different ways. You can buy them in cans and they'll look kind of like this when you open them. You can buy them in jars. You can cook them yourself from a dried state. When you cook them, they get large and creamy like this. These are Great Northerns. From a dried state, you would take your beans and you would just cover them in water and soak them overnight or at least for a few hours. And then drain that water off, put fresh water on, and just turn your stove on and let them simmer for a few hours until they're soft. It takes at least an hour. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3, depending upon how old your beans were before you started soaking them. So the last thing we need to prep is our chicken. We're going to use about 1.5 pounds of chicken. I have chicken breasts and chicken thighs in here. These are both boneless. I'm doing this last because when you touch raw meat, you need to wash your hands very carefully and not spread bacteria around the kitchen. Chicken can have a bacteria on it called salmonella. Salmonella is tasteless, it's colorless. That means you won't know if the chicken had it. It's not dangerous for the chicken, but for you, if your chicken is undercooked and you ate it, you could get very, very sick. So, see this fatty part of the chicken? I don't want that. I'm gonna put that in my scrap box. So my scrap box would not be making a vegetable broth. It would be making a poultry broth of some sort because it has chicken in it now. So I just check out the breast and I'm trimming off any of the fat because we don't need that extra fat. We just want protein. The chicken breast won't have a lot of fat, but the thighs will when we get to the thighs. So I'm just going to cut it into little chunks about this big. They shrink when they cook, so they'll be a little smaller after you cook them. And I'm putting them back in the bowl that's holding the whole pieces because why dirty more bowls than you have to? So I'm just cutting across it and cutting it into chunks. If you had chicken that was already cooked, if you roasted one for dinner the night before and had leftover chicken, you could just tear that off the bones and add it at the end after everything else cooks. If you have pets in your house, your pets might sit patiently hoping you drop something as mine is right now. I have meat out, so he's trying to persuade me to drop some on the floor. It's not going to happen, Ziggy, sorry. All right, this is a chicken thigh. You notice it's a lot fattier. This is from the, you'll hear it referred to as dark meat chicken. And a little fat's okay, but we don't want huge chunks of fat. So like I'll leave this little bit, but this big hunk up here has gristle in it. So it would not taste as good. It would be a little too chewy, but we don't want to waste the part that's good. So we're going to try to cut around it. All right. Now the rest should be just fine. We're just going to cut it up and add it to our bowl. Our chicken's all cut up and I thoroughly washed my hands to make sure there's no bacteria from the raw chicken on my hands. Our cutting board and knife are in the sink. We'll wash those up while the chili simmers. We're ready to start cooking. So I'm at my stove. I have a good sized stock pot. This one holds 6 quarts, I think. You'll need something at least that big for this. Well, about that big. You don't need it much bigger. I'm drizzling some oil in the bottom of my pot. This is avocado oil. You don't have to use avocado oil. I just really love it because of its health properties, and it's a very neutral taste. One other thing I did not show that I have over here is some chicken broth. I made this chicken broth and had it frozen, so I thawed it out. You can use chicken broth from a box. You can use base or bouillon cubes. If you do that, be very careful though, because those are super salty and it might make your chili too salty. So this is chicken broth that I made. If you don't have broth on hand, you can use water. It's fine. It just won't be quite as rich, but it will still be delicious. So my oil is heating. And once again, I had mentioned this on the marinara lesson. I'm swirling it around so it coats. You probably can't see it shimmering, but we want to get it hot enough to saute the vegetables we're about to put in. I'll show you how to test it. I'm getting a little water on my finger, and when I splash it in, you'll hear the sizzle. That's what we want. So I'm adding the onions. It's too bad you can't smell through video because it smells fantastic. But it's about to smell even better. And we're going to saute these until they start to turn a little bit translucent. That means you'll start to be able to see through them and they won't be solid white anymore. They'll look more clear. They'll even start to brown around the edges because of how hot we have our pan. Alright. I don't know if the video lets you see the difference, but they are starting to get clear around the edges. Now we're going to add our tomatoes. And the tomatoes will start to release their juices, and you can hear the sizzle gets a little bit quieter because of the juices. Now we're going to add our spices. This is called blooming your spices. When you fry them in a little oil before you put everything else in the dish, it helps them release their flavor later. So we're adding our spices, and we're going to stir them up. We're going to let this cook just as it is now for about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. You'll need to stir it very frequently, otherwise it will stick, and we don't want it to stick. If it does seem like it's starting to stick, you can add just a tiny little bit of water. I sometimes keep a little cup of water next to the stove with me. The part that sticks, this is not sticking yet. Maybe barely on the edges. Do you see how it's starting to coat the skillet? That's called fond. And fond is delicious. It's the browning of veggies, or sometimes meats, in this case veggies and spices, and it gives our dish flavor. Sometimes we want that. We want things to stick a little. And then when you add a liquid, it's called deglazing. Mine wasn't really stuck. It would have sounded like a sizzle if it was. But I'm adding a little bit anyway. And at this point in time, I'm going to add the carrots and celery. And the can of green chilies. Oh, it smells fantastic. And it's not even cooked yet. gonna add our garlic. I did not add the garlic earlier when I put the onions in because garlic browns really, really fast and we didn't want it to burn. So I wanted a little more moisture in there before I added it. Different dishes have different properties. Some dishes you want to brown your garlic. For this particular one, I did not want to. And it is starting to simmer. Can you hear it? So at this point, I'm going to add the chicken broth. I'm going to let it come to a boil. And I'm going to put the lid on it and I'm going to cover it. And I'm just going to let it simmer for a little while before I add anything else like the beans or the chicken or salt and pepper. Our beans are already cooked, so they don't need to be added in at the beginning because they're already soft. So we want our carrots and our celery and the rest of our vegetables to cook down and become soft and kind of blend together before we add those ingredients. So we're going to cover this. We're going to let it cook for about probably 15 to 20 minutes and then we'll come back and show you the rest. Hey guys, I have a secret lesson inside of a lesson. Our chili is simmering. Well, part of it's simmering. Our vegetables are simmering. And while they simmer, I'm going to show you what we like to eat with our chili. I'm going to show you a really quick and easy and delicious way to make cornbread. And there's lots of variations on it, but this is one of my favorites. I like to bake in a cast iron skillet. So I'm going to take my cast iron skillet and pour just a little bit of that lovely avocado oil in it. If you don't have avocado oil, you can use butter, you can use cooking oil, you can use pan spray, whatever you have. But you're going to go ahead and just smear it around the bottom of the pan. Like that. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna set that aside so I have a space to work on. I'm just setting it on the stove. By the way, I turned my oven on 400 degrees to preheat for this. So I have my bowl. I'm making cornbread, so I'm going to start with cornmeal. I'm gonna use 1.5 cups of cornmeal. This is a 1/2 cup measuring cup. So I'm putting 3 of those in. That equals 1.5 cups. Now you can use all cornmeal for this recipe, but I like to lighten the bread up by, Maggie, would you move that for me, please? Thank you. By adding a little bit of flour in it as well. So I'm using gluten-free flour because I have to eat gluten-free. You can use regular flour or you can use all cornmeal. So I'm using a 1/2 cup of that. And I'm gonna mix it in. Thank you. Now I also want to add a little sugar. You can add honey, you can add sugar. I'm going to add about 4 tablespoons of sugar in. I dropped my lid and Maggie just saved me. Luckily it landed face up so there's no dirt on it. All right, thank you, Maggie. All right, so we have sugar, flour, and cornmeal in this bowl. Now I'm going to add baking soda. I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of baking soda. And I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And I'm going to add, my recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm only going to add 1/2 teaspoon because the butter that I have here at home has salt in it already, and I don't want my bread to be too salty. So I added 1/2 teaspoon of salt. If you have unsalted butter, you would want to add a whole teaspoon. So I need 4 tablespoons of butter for this. If you look at your stick of butter, you can see it has little marks on it that tell you what a tablespoon is. A stick of butter is exactly 8 tablespoons, so we're going to use half of this stick. And I want it melted. So I'm just going to put it in a microwave safe container and I'm going to melt it. It'll probably take about 30 seconds. So we have cornmeal, flour, baking soda, baking powder, sugar, and salt. I'm just mixing that all together. I want it thoroughly mixed. You don't want to see any streaks of white in there. You want it to all look the same color. Just stir it around until you're all mixed up. One thing I want to mention about butter, if you're melting your butter in a microwave, don't walk away. Keep an eye on it. Butter has milk proteins in it, and it can go from slowly melting to boiling over and making a huge mess in a matter of seconds. I ended up stopping my butter at 20 seconds instead of 30, and it almost boiled over. You can also melt it on a stove, whatever you have. So I have a measuring cup here. We need 1.5 cups of liquid or moisture added to this. My favorite thing for making all kinds of bread, cornbread, muffins, anything, I like to use plain yogurt. Not everybody likes yogurt, but I'm going to use 1 cup of yogurt and 1/2 cup of milk. So first I'm measuring out my milk. And then I'm just going to add my yogurt in until all of it, the milk and the yogurt, has moved up to 1.5 cups. I could have used the 1/2 cup measuring cup as well that I had for my flours, but I already started doing it this way, so that's fine. Cornbread is a very, very forgiving recipe. You could use all milk, you could use coconut milk, you could use all yogurt, you could use almond milk if you wanted. Whatever you have, you can use it. I just love the way it tastes when you do it with yogurt. All right, so I have my yogurt and my milk in this cup. I'm going to stir it all up until it's blended pretty thoroughly. And then I'm going to add an egg to it and beat that in there a little bit. You just need 1 large egg for this. If you have really tiny eggs, you might have to put 2, but large eggs are the best. And then I'm going to add that melted butter into that liquid mixture. And then I'm just going to add it all to the cornbread. Baking powder is activated by dairy, so you would need to have some kind of dairy. Otherwise, your baking powder won't make your cornmeal rise. And that's all there is to making cornbread, guys. I'm going to scrape this into my skillet and pop it into my oven, which has preheated to 400 degrees. And then we're going to check on our chili. It should be just about ready to add the beans and then the chicken. All right, I'm gonna set my oven timer for 20 minutes. It might take 25, but it's always best to start checking it a little before you think it'll be done so that it doesn't overcook. Our vegetables have been simmering for about 20 minutes. Look how beautiful they look. They no longer look hard and crunchy. It looks more like a soup. That is what we want. We're going to take that and we are going to add our meat and our beans. By the way, this was a Great Northern bean. These started as a 1 pound package of dried beans. If you're using canned beans instead of cooking your own dried beans, you would want 3 cans. And you would probably want to drain the juice off of at least 2 of those cans, otherwise it could make your chili not thick enough. So you can see the proportion of veggies to beans now. Looks pretty yummy. Now our beans were cool, so they lowered the temperature of everything else when we added them to the pot. So we're gonna turn the flame up a little bit, bring that back up to temperature before we add our meat. Our beans and vegetables are boiling and they smell fantastic. You could stop and eat this right here if you didn't have meat to add. But we have chicken, so we're going to add all of our chicken in that we chopped up earlier. Now at this point, we have to let it cook until all that meat is cooked thoroughly. I do want to mention at this point in the game, this is simmering, our cornbread is baking. If you pan over to our sink, we have a sink full of dirty dishes. This is the perfect time to do your dirty dishes and clean up after yourself while you're waiting for everything else to be done. If you wait until after you've eaten your meal, your tummy will be full, you'll feel sleepy, you'll be lethargic, you won't want to clean. So clean now. Oh guys, that's our oven timer. That's our cornbread. Let's check it out. Oh yeah. Doesn't that look yummy? Ooh, and let's check our chili out while we're over here. It looks done to me. Hey, hey, I think that's dinner. Look at that. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson on how to make a white bean chicken chili and the sneak bonus lesson on how to make cornbread to go along with it. If you don't have any of the ingredients that I used, if you're out of fresh tomatoes for an example, but you have a can of tomatoes, throw them in there. It'll be fine. Stews and soups are so forgiving. If you're missing something, if you don't have any fresh garlic, you can use some garlic powder. You wouldn't want to use as much as we did. You'd probably want to start with about a teaspoon and then taste it at the end. I did sample our chili at the end, and I added a little bit of salt and a little bit of black pepper, but it didn't need much at all. I probably added half a teaspoon of salt to that entire pot. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Once again, this is Miss Cindy with the Boys and Girls Club of Greater St. Louis, and this is dinner. Bye guys, see you next time.